Welcome to Chapter 9, which is one of the shorter chapters, but there's so much condensed in here. Plus, I've taught a whole class on this, so it's a lot of really good material here. So let's go ahead and get started. Here are our chapter objectives. We're going to learn about identifying the characteristics of an older population, refuting the commonly held myths about them, describe the factors that affect the size and the age of the population. If you don't come away with anything else from this lecture, know that there's just a whole lot more elderly people in the United States than there have ever been before. Describe the older adults' demographics, briefly outline elder abuse and neglect in the United States, illustrate the 6 instrumental needs of older adults, describe housing options, briefly summarize the Older Americans Act, and list the commonly provided services for older adults in most communities. All right. The number of older adults and their proportion, like what is their percentage, how many of them are there compared to how many of them, like in a group of 100 people, how many of them are elderly today versus how many of them in a similar size group would have been there, say, 100 years ago. It has increased significantly in the last 100 years. Today they represent about 15% of the population, which is about 1 out of every 7 of us. And we are going to break down the group into 3 groups. So all of these people are considered elderly, but you have some that are the young old. And this is important because the young old potentially are still working and their health is probably a lot better, and they are, just generally more engaged with the community. You're probably seeing them more often. They're not as in nursing homes as often, more engaged, more active. And then there's the middle old, 75 to 84. By this time, most of them have stopped working, and there's a kind of a push to have them stay healthy. And then there's the old, which are those people who are 85 and older. And this is actually a very large growing group in the United States today. Well, I shouldn't say it's large. It is growing. Most people don't make it to 85, but the number of people who do is increasing. And here I've got a kind of a thrifty, well, this is actually in the future. So maybe this is going to restart. Here it is. So if you can see in 1900s, the number of people who are elderly is very small. It's like 1%. But then as time goes by, it's 1950, this number of people just keeps going up. And then as a percentage, the number of people who are young is going down. And now you hear the year I was born. And so this population is increasing. And now we're seeing some of the older, the oldest, the old pop up here as well. And we're definitely flatlining here a lot more. We're now in the future. By 2060, the population is expected to continue to grow. So I wish this didn't move so fast, but I guess you can go to calculatedriskblog.com to see it again. So, all right. Let's talk about some myths. Ageism is a prejudice, where prejudice is about thoughts, negative ideas toward people. You might say it's hatred, although maybe that's an extreme word, but it's like, I'm not going to hang out with them, I'm not going to hire them because they're not as good, right? And then discrimination is the act. So prejudice exists here, and maybe discrimination exists here. Again, probably the area where it hurts people the most is in their jobs. They don't get hired, or their health care. People don't listen to them as much. So, a common myth is something like elderly people are going to die, or the fact that elderly people can't use technology. Elderly people are not as smart. Elderly people are always sick. Elderly people don't understand the world very well, right? The reality is that majority of older adults today are actually active and well, more so than they've ever have been in the past. Many of them are still working, and I think the trend is going to continue, meaning you're going to see more elderly people in the workforce in the future than you have in the past, because people, your age, my age, we need to be expecting to live to be 90 years old. And so we can't be retiring at 65 because there's just too much time to retire. We can't afford it. And then many are strongly engaged in their community, volunteer, and advocacy programs. All right, let's talk about some demographics. The size and the growth of older adult population is increasingly, it grew significantly during the 20th, so that's the 1900s, and the 21st centuries. Older adult population is projected to continue growing. The baby boom generation, they were between, I think, 1946 and 1965, I think. World War II was done. Times were better than they were before. The future looked bright, and a lot of people wanted to have children, and so a lot of babies were born during that time period. They are now they're now like in their, well, some of them are now entering their mid-70s, all the way down to, I guess, well, their mid-50s. And so this group of 85 plus is the fastest growing age segment of our population. So all of this growth in the number of elderly people is causing our median age. So if you line up every American on a wall and the person in the middle, that's the median, it's beginning to move farther to the right, so getting older. So this is an age pyramid, I think, or a population pyramid, this thing on the left. Usually it's more pyramid-like, and you can see back in 1960s it was more pyramid-like, because what you can see here is that the number of people who are 0 to 4 is the largest group, and then 5 to 9 because some of them have passed away, and 10 to 14, and that trend kind of mostly follows. So you have less and less and less people. By the time you hit to 85, you have a very small number. But if you jump over here to 2060, what you see is we don't no longer have a pyramid. We have more like a skyscraper, where it's pretty even, and in fact, there's more middle-aged people here than there are younger people, because we had a lot of babies right here, and then we're having less of them today. So there's less young people, and there's more older people. And as far as I know, this is the first time this has happened. It's certainly the first time it's happened in the United States. Maybe somewhere else in the world at some point in history, there were a lot more. So one thing to notice here is that if you look up here at the 85 plus, it's really obvious. There's a whole lot more women than there are men. All right. Factors affecting population size and age. So how do we come to this? What's going on? So fertility rates had a large role to play here. We had very high fertility rates relative to before and after, and that group of people was known as the baby boomers. I mentioned them before. That's the group 1946 to 1964. I said 65, but anyway, it's just a kind of a man-made or social idea to help us understand what's going on. Other things that have affected this is the fact that we're not dying as much as we used to. Mortality rates have been cut in half between 1900 and 2017. Okay? And then the life expectancy has continued to increase, especially in the 20th century, so 1900s. How does this affect the economy? So economists have something that they refer to as the dependency ratio. And what that is that it's looking at people by their age, and they're saying, you know what, if you're 3 years old, it's probably a pretty safe bet that you are not economically productive, right? So you're economically unproductive. You're not producing goods and services for the economy. And that's okay, because your parents are probably economically productive, right? And so this is traditionally defined by age. So they're going to look at younger children, and then they're going to look at elderly people, and saying they're also not economically productive. And the issue here, the reason why they track this, is that you don't want too many people who are economically unproductive, because they're still using goods and services. Maybe you have your 4-year-old is still eating, and they still need a roof over their heads and transportation and healthcare. That you can't have too many of those and too few people who are working, because there won't be enough goods and services to go around. Right? And then there's a labor force ratio, and this is just a little bit more accurate because it actually looks at the number of people who are working and comparing those to the people who are not, and it's not about age. So they're actually looking at who is actually working, because there are some 83-year-old people who are working, or 85 or 90-year-old people who are working, and there are some 30-year-old people who are not working. So a labor force ratio is probably the better thing to look at in terms of knowing, you know, are we going to be okay? Are we going to have enough goods and services to provide for everybody that needs them? And so the prediction is that this ratio of workers to non-workers is going to be getting smaller, like the difference between them. You're going to have less and less people producing and more people who are not producing. That's because you have a lot more people who are going to be entering retirement age and leaving the workforce. Yeah, that's kind of how that's going to go. So in addition to the things we've already mentioned, there are other factors that affect community health programs, and those are things like marital status. Oftentimes this makes a difference in people's health, living arrangements, the racial and ethnic composition, where they are at geographically, economic status, housing, and education. We'll actually cover several of those here in future slides in more detail. Marital status. About 3/4 of older men are married. Just under half of older women are married. And so, wow, that's a big difference. You have 50% more men who are married as compared to older women. Why is this? Because women tend to outlive their husbands. About 1/3 of women are widowed. Oh, and women are less likely to get remarried if they get divorced, whereas men are more likely to get married if they're divorced. That also affects that number. The number of divorced and separated older adults continues to rise. Right, and so, you know, in the 1980s and 90s, the divorce rates were really high, and those people back then were probably in their 30s and 40s and 50s, and so now they are elderly, and so as a divorced person, they are, you know, now, as an older person rather, they are now divorced or separated. And so why does this impact their health? Well, especially for women, they lack retirement benefits that they might have traditionally had because of their husband's Social Security or retirement benefits through his you know, his work or whatnot, insurance, and then just lower net worth. Two people can typically live cheaper than one person alone, and so if you have more people who are separated, they're going to have a harder time doing that. Living arrangements. This is oftentimes linked to income and how healthy they are, and if there's someone to take care of them. So for instance, if I can afford to live alone, most of the time I will, you know. And if I am healthy enough to live alone, then I probably will. And if I can hire someone to take care of me in my home, then I'll probably stay in my home. But if none of those are possible, then I'll probably leave my home or not live alone. So over half of non-institutionalized older adults, and so what I kind of naturally think of is here is if they're not in a nursing home, they live with someone else. So most of the time, older adults are living with someone else if they're not in a nursing home. But women are more likely to live alone compared to men because, again, they're outliving typically their male partners. Only 1.2 million older adults live in nursing homes. I think there are 55 million older people today in America, so that is, what, 2% roughly of older Americans who are living in nursing homes. And it's important to point out that nursing homes are medical facilities. They are not places for old people. So you can't just go to a nursing home if you're 90. That doesn't work like that. You have to have a medical condition. That's why it's a nursing home. They were created as substitutes for hospitals. So 3/4 of nursing home residents are women. Our health does tend to get worse as we get older. And if women are outliving men, then it makes sense that there are going to be more of them in the nursing homes. More than half of nursing home residents are 85 years or more. All right, let's look at racial and ethnic composition. The older population is less diverse than the younger population, but it is growing more diverse as time goes on, as people who used to be younger and more people of color, they are now getting older, and so as time goes on, our elderly population is growing more African American, more Hispanic, more Asian American, so on. In the coming decades, the percentage of white older adults will decline, as it same will with non-older adults and youth, and older Americans of Hispanic origin will become the second largest minority group in the United States, right? So as you can see right here, right now, African Americans are the largest minority, but in the future, Hispanic Americans will be. Looking at geographic distribution, where are elderly people located at? So 51% of them are in just 9 states. Of those 9 states, California, Florida, and Texas have the largest population numbers. I do want to point out that Texas and Florida and California just have the largest populations, period, except for New York. New York belongs in there. The thing is that most of the people in New York State live in New York City, and many times people in New York City, after they retire, they go somewhere warmer, and so Florida has this kind of joke about how their accent is a New York accent because so many people from New York move to Florida after they retire. So New York gives pretty good retirement benefits to its workers, and the taxes in Florida are cheaper, which feels a little bit like you're cheating the system, you know, because like you're leaving because the taxes are high, but it's the same taxes that are paying you your benefits. That's why they're high. So anyway, why are some states older than others? Well, a lot of people like to go to warmer states like Florida, like Texas, because it is easier to live in some of those states because the taxes are lower. I just mentioned that. But also when you're elderly, it is harder to stay cooler. You lose some of the fat in the skin layers, and so it becomes harder to stay warm. It's also harder to stay cool in the summers, but apparently people aren't as concerned about that in Florida, apparently. So, but also that sometimes younger people will leave the kind of the farm belt states, which is like Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, you know, Iowa. Those states are losing in population compared to the rest of them, so that also impacts that. I'm going to redo that one. All right, let's talk about education. The percentage of older adults who completed high school rose from 28% back in 1970 to 87%. So elderly people today are much more educated than they were back in the 1970s, which was about 50 years ago. 25% of older adults have a bachelor's degree or higher. This is great because typically people are much healthier as their education increases. However, there are differences based upon race and ethnicity, with some races having more education and others having less. Overall, though, the baby boomers, who are today between the ages of, say, 75, 76 as of 2022 to about 55, let's say, they are the most educated group in U.S. history. So yes, we are getting more educated. Let's talk about housing. This is a major concern for people when they are elderly. The good news is that most live in adequate, affordable housing. 75% of them own their house. Hopefully they own it outright without a mortgage, because that helps, especially when it comes to adjusting for things like inflation. 25% of them rent. All right, some bad news here. Older adults' homes tend to be older and of lower value, and they need more repairs than if you compare those homes to people who are younger. For most older adults, housing represents an asset. So it's something that they have that is of worth, and they can go to the bank and get a loan against it so that maybe they can go to the doctor or do something to maybe they just need basic care and paying for that. So let's look at the health profile of older adults. How healthy are they? So the health status of older adults has improved over the years, as evidenced by the fact that we are living longer and we can do more things. Right? The number of people who are chronically disabled has been decreasing. Right? We're doing healthy behaviors. We have more technology that allows people to not have to deal with disabilities as much. So, however, their health status is usually not as good as younger counterparts. Right? It seems as though biologically our bodies tend to break down as we get older. That doesn't mean we can't resist that. It doesn't mean that we can't do things to keep ourselves healthier longer. But if you compare somebody who's elderly compared to somebody who's in their teens, the teenager is going to be healthier on average because their habits and the environment hasn't had the time to wear on the body. All right, looking at mortality, causes of death. The top causes of death for older adults are heart disease, cancer, CLRD, which is chronic lower respiratory disease, things like emphysema and asthma, bronchitis, occupational lung disease, oftentimes related to smoking. Stroke and Alzheimer's disease are the top causes. Looking at morbidity relating to disease, disability. Activity limitations increase with age. We are not able to do as much, as we get older. Maybe as a younger person, you could jump really high, you could run a marathon. It becomes harder to do that with age. Again, not impossible, especially if you continue to do it, but it does become harder to do. Chronic conditions, they are a substantial burden on somebody's health and on the economic status of individuals, of the family, and then just the nation. So chronic conditions like heart disease, like diabetes, these are expensive, and not just for the individual and the family, but just for the nation in general, as many times elderly people have Medicare, which is a national taxpayer funded, at least partially. So that's very expensive, right? I'm not saying it's bad that we're spending a lot of money, but the reality is it is very expensive. Impairments, they are very prevalent in older adults. I think of things like the sense of taste and sight and smell, right? Could be related to memory or physical movements. They're just more common among elderly. So I kind of feel like in the beginning we talked about some of the myths and tried to kind of tear them down, and it's like we're kind of building them back up, but I'm not trying to. I think that the lesson here is that the myth is that, oh, if you're older, therefore you probably can't see or smell very well, you're probably not athletic. That's the myth. The reality is, though, that as we age, we are more likely to have impairments. We are more likely to have limitations placed on us. All right, health behaviors and lifestyle choices. So here's something really interesting. The elderly generally have better health behaviors than young people. Elderly people are less likely to consume large amounts of alcohol. They're less likely to smoke cigarettes. They're less likely to be overweight. Now, maybe it's because they know that those things are going to hurt them, and they're thinking, this is going to kill me really soon, whereas younger people are thinking, oh, well, 50 years old is forever away. Or it could be that the elderly people who drank a lot and smoked a lot and were overweight have already passed. It's probably a combination of both of those. Areas for improvement. Physical activity is probably the big one. Elderly people still need to be physically active. And then immunizations, because immunizations teach our immune system how to fight off foreign invaders, and as we age, our immune system becomes more compromised, and so immunizations are more important, you could argue, when you're elderly. All right, more detail here related to physical activity. Older adults are the least physically active of any age group, right? And this is a problem because it's oftentimes a situation where either you use it or you lose it when it comes to things like muscle mass, and it's harder to rebuild muscle when you're older. I already experienced this, you know. And so elderly people need at least 150 minutes a week of moderately intense exercise, such as a brisk walk, at least 2 days a week of activities that strengthen muscles, and activities that improve balance, like standing on one foot, are really important. So, however, only about 12% of older adults meet the physical activity guidelines. You know, not very many adults meet the physical guidelines, but even less elderly adults meet the physical activity guidelines. What are the nutritional needs for older adults? Well, they're basically the same ones as for the rest of the population. Eat less salt, get less calories from sugars and fats, eat more vegetables, drink more water. All right, looking at obesity. The number of obese adults has increased. In 2014, 35% of those who are 65 and older are obese. Only 27% of older adults are in a healthy weight range. That goes back to the previous slide, looking at reducing the number of calories that come from fats and sugars. All right, looking at cigarettes. Just over 8% of older adults are cigarette smokers, and this has come down significantly over the past few decades. Of special concern are older adults who are not currently smoking, but maybe have in the past, and that puts them at higher risk for things like chronic lower respiratory disease. Vaccinations. Our immune systems tend to weaken as we get older. Therefore, immunizations are more important for older adults than they are for non-older adults. However, in a given season, for instance, the 2018-2019 flu season, only about 68% of older adults received flu vaccinations. And I wouldn't be surprised if that number actually has gone down, because during COVID, there was so much talk about conspiracy theories and vaccinations that I imagine that has trickled over into things like the flu vaccination. Vaccination rates among older adults have improved over time, but racial disparities exist. African Americans specifically have just really been mistreated when it comes to things like vaccinations, and so there's sort of a history of distrust there. So there's actually generally less vaccinations among African Americans. Moving on to talk about the mistreatment of older adults in America, reports have increased greatly in recent years. Does that mean that the number of elderly people who have been mistreated has increased greatly in recent years? Maybe, maybe not. It's just that there's more reports coming in. Maybe more people are aware of how to make reports, or there's an increased visibility that would allow people from the outside to see the fact that elderly people are being mistreated. So, females are abused at higher rates. They oftentimes have less power in their relationships. And people who are at most in need of other people. If you think about who is neglected, who is mistreated, it's people who are the most vulnerable. That's children and that's elderly people. And so who are the most vulnerable among the elderly? Well, it's your 80-year and older adults, neglected at 2 to 3 times more than elderly population. 2/3 of the time, their perpetrators are their adult children or spouses. I imagine most people who are mistreating older adults are not quote unquote bad people. They are people who are using wrong methods of dealing with conflict and problems. Maybe the older person has dementia and it's just very difficult on a daily basis to care for them, to interact with them. And so when we are dealing with someone who's difficult to be with, we are more likely to mistreat them, to abuse them. That doesn't excuse it. We still have a responsibility to care for people, but it helps us find the solution. It's like, oh, okay, so the solution, the issue is not that you're a terrible person who enjoys hurting people. The issue is you don't know how to deal with this problem. And so we can give them a solution. We are going to talk about the 6 instrumental needs that everybody needs in order to thrive in society. Those are income, housing, personal care, healthcare, transportation, and community facilities. Everybody needs these, whether they're 4 or whether they're 84, but as we age, our ability to access them and what we need from them may change. So let's dive into them. Okay, starting with income. We may have a change in the expenses as we get older, especially in healthcare. We just have a lot more need to spend money on healthcare. This is maybe more difficult as we're older because oftentimes when people are in their elderly years, they're unable to work or they're not willing or not wanting to work, and so they may be living on the income that they made, in the decades past. Right. All right. Income has improved significantly in recent years. We're making more. Women are making a lot more than they have in the past. For many people, Social Security is a major source of income. Social Security was started, I think, back during the 1920s or 30s, so it's been around for a long time. However, it is in jeopardy because there's just a lot more people pulling Social Security funds than there had been in the past. Unmarried women and minorities have the highest rates of poverty. Unmarried women may not have the funds that were set aside if they maybe were unmarried or they separated, or even if they were widowed. You only have a certain amount of money, and if the man is dying earlier, then the woman has to have those amount of funds stretch longer for her than maybe say her husband did. Minorities also, they tend to make less money, and so they're going to have less money set aside for retirement. All right, let's move on to housing, which is a major expense for a lot of people, especially if they're living in and around a city. Fortunately for most of us who are living in the country, it's a lot cheaper. The major needs regarding housing are appropriateness, accessibility, adequacy, and affordability. Can the person afford to live where they are living? Especially as the needs may change. It may be that the house that they're living in is on the 3rd story. That may not be appropriate anymore, and the house that they need that has maybe it doesn't have stairs and it has light bulbs that are not difficult to reach, and it has guardrails near areas where it's easier to fall. That may be more expensive for them. So can they get into there? Is it available to them? Can they afford it? Is it enough? However, changing residence can have negative effects. If you've lived somewhere for a long time and you've become comfortable and familiar with that, and it may be that you really struggle living somewhere else, especially if you have memory issues where you're not able to remember where do we keep these spare boxes of tissues, and where do I place my keys when I come in the door. And so it may be that in the first place you knew because you've been practicing these habits for decades, but in the new place that's not happening. So there are a variety of housing options available for elderly people. Independent living, obviously that's probably what most people are doing before
they go into these other options. Assisted living. Assisted living is what I think of as a dormitory for elderly people. The nice thing about it is that oftentimes people can age in place. So they may come in and they may be higher functioning. They can cook their own meals. They can take their own medication. They can wash themselves. And then as they lose those abilities, there are people there that can help them do those. And then oftentimes they can even die there. They'll allow hospice and people to come in and care for them in those last years. There's a continuing care retirement communities. So there are retirement communities that with a little bit more independence, but there are also maybe nursing stations or people who will come in and help as the need arises. So it's kind of similar to assisted living. It's just that I think of assisted living as being one unit, whereas retirement communities as being lots of different units. Nursing homes or skilled nursing facilities, I believe those are just two terms for the same thing. A nursing home is not a place for older people. Most people who are at nursing homes are elderly, but they're actually medical facilities. So no matter what age you are, you can't just go into a nursing home and accept, be admitted. You have to have a medical problem that necessitates you being there. So, all right, personal care. 4 levels of tasks that may need assistance. So these are 4 things in order to care for yourself that are required. Instrumental tasks like cooking breakfast. Expressive tasks like writing a letter or sending an email. Cognitive tasks like arranging a doctor's visit so that you have transportation in order to get there, that you don't have something else going on, right? And then tasks of daily living. This could be, washing your hands, taking your medication, things like that. So, activities of daily living, or ADLs, that sometimes it shows up on charts. These measure the functional limitations. It may be that as the person, goes from being 70 to 80, they have more limitations on their ADLs, and then as they move from 80 to 90, they, have increased limitations. I would think about somebody from say 70 to 80, maybe they would stop driving, and so now their function or transportation function is limited, and then maybe from 80 to 90 they lose the ability to, say, wash their feet. Instrumental activities of daily living, IADLs, measure more complex tasks. So it may be that on the surface the person can present well and it seems as though they can do everything, but instrumental activities would include more complicated things like arranging to go to the doctor, and that's going to require not just arranging it with the doctor's office, but arranging it with the person who is going to be driving you, and arranging it so that you're not going to be missing a meal with the meal delivery service. Because sometimes meal delivery services have to know when you're going to be there and when you're not there. And if you're not there, they're assuming something bad happened, so they may be contacting the authorities. Caregivers. People who are caring for older adults face numbers of problems. Oftentimes, the caregiver of the older adult is a female child. They're oftentimes the ones that play this role. Increased financial burden in 2 ways, really. One is if they're caring for the older adult, they may not be able to work, or maybe not be able to work as much, so that means their income is going to go down, but then they may also be spending more money in caring for that older person. There may be a lack of privacy, especially if that caregiver is living with the elderly. Right? Demands on time and energy. The need for personal care and paying for long-term care services for older is projected to increase in the coming years. I was just having a conversation with a friend about this actually, and he was saying that, it used to be in maybe 100 years ago that when someone grew older, the expectation was that their children would care for them during their elderly years when they were needing help, I should say. And I was like, that's true, but one of the things to realize is that we weren't living as long 100 years ago as we are today, and we were functional for much longer than we are today. So in the past, we died from much more of acute illnesses. Someone would get sick and then they would die maybe a couple of weeks later. But whereas today, we are really good at keeping people alive, and so people may be needing care for a decade, whereas maybe in the past it would have just been a few weeks or months or even a few years. So today there's a lot less children who are caring for a lot more elderly people, and so there's a real concern as to who is going to care for these people. So let's talk about health care. Older adults are the heaviest users of healthcare services. We tend to use more and more healthcare as we get older. And in fact, of all the money that is spent on healthcare in the United States, most of it goes to treating people's health conditions in the last few years of their life. Where's all this money coming from? Well, Medicare, which is the government taxpayer-funded medical program, is the primary source of payments for healthcare services of older adults. And if you look at the budget for the federal government, a lot of it is for Medicare as a program, which you could argue, hey, it's great, it's good, we should be spending a lot of money on that, better than on bombs. It will see major changes in future years. As you have more and more people who are elderly, who are using more and more healthcare services, we'll have to figure out how to fund those programs. Transportation in some form or another is really good because it allows adults to interact with other people. And interacting is not optional. When people don't get out or interact with other people in some form or fashion, they really suffer. In fact, there's research that shows that people that are lonely, especially in their elderly years, it's as bad as smoking like a half a pack of cigarettes a day. And so it's not something that's optional. It's easy to think like, oh, well, I just don't need to go out this week. It's no big deal. I have everything I need. I'm just going to kind of hang out by myself, or Grandpa's going to hang out by himself. But no, it's really important. And if they can have their own transportation, then it allows them to remain independent. And there are all kinds of like modifications that you could do. Like you could have them, set them up with Uber, or some sort of a self-driving car potentially here in the near future, and that would just sort of allow them to be less reliant, because most elderly people are reluctant to ask for help when it comes to transportation. So there's a lot of public transportation challenges. If you don't live in an urban area or even a small city, it's tough to access public transportation. Community facilities and services. The Older Americans Act of 1965 increased services and protect the rights of older adults. So when this was passed, it created nutritional programs which are the funding that go to programs like the Meals on Wheels program that maybe a local senior center operates under. It also created the Department of Aging and area agencies on aging. Many of our local communities will have an agency that you can call and say, the elderly person needs this service, where do I go? And they can kind of steer you in the right direction, help you find those things. So services can vary greatly across the country. I would imagine that places like Florida that have a lot of older people and people who are politically active, those are going to be much better. Whereas if you were to go to areas that are much poorer and have less elderly people in them, the services aren't as great. All right, let's talk about some of the community facilities and services that are available to people. I already mentioned a meal service. And if the person can come in and eat that meal in a communal environment, then it's generally better for them because they're getting out and they're meeting and interacting with other people, and maybe they're going to throw in a bingo game. Homemaker services, somebody who's going to come and sweep and clean and change some light bulbs, maybe. Chore and home maintenance services, they may need a new sink or new stairs so they don't fall or hurt themselves on their way down. Visitor services. Sometimes the person isn't able to leave the home safely, and so somebody needs to come in and just visit with them. That's really important. Again, we are social creatures, and when we are solo, we don't do as well. Adult daycare. That is a place where you're going to bring somebody who is an adult, and maybe they're an elderly adult or maybe they're a non-elderly adult, and that place is going to care for them while their caretaker is doing something else, probably at work. Respite care is much more temporary. It tends to be a shorter amount of time, and the elderly person may be in the home. What it does is it gives a break, a respite to the caregiver, right? And this is good because it gives a break to the person who's the caretaker, but it also probably prevents mistreatment, because maybe that person, the caregiver, hasn't been out of the home or been away from the elderly person in a week, and they're beginning to forget who they are outside of just their role as a caretaker. Home health care services, somebody who's coming to the home and doing that. Senior centers and other services. So this lecture has gone on longer than I wanted to. So that is all. Thank you for watching.